Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the CEO of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace. Welcome to both of you. So as ever, let's take a look, shall we, at the front pages. Starting with the Daily Mail, it leads with police fears that the baby of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon has come to harm after the pair were arrested on Monday night. Leading the Daily Express tomorrow is Rishi's Brexit boost for the UK, which celebrates the new deal with the European Union. The Eye reporting on the new Brexit agreement on Northern Ireland. Their headline, Sunak gambles his political career on defying the Brexit deal critics. The FT leads with a report that Jaguar Land Rover owner Tata Motors is demanding more than £500 million from the government aid to build a new battery factory in Britain. Arms of Love, writes the Daily Mirror, reporting on a story of a father who can finally hold his twin daughters again after a double hand transplant. And the Daily Star has a story on the price of veg for market traders as they say the salad crisis worsens. Well, a reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's head straight to Sonia Sodha and Mark Wallace. And Sonia, let's go to the Daily Mail, shall we? The real concerns now about this a 2-month-old baby and this massive search underway near Brighton now. Real concern.
It's such a worrying story, Anna. So it's a couple who went missing with their baby very shortly after they had their newborn in early January. They've been on the run for over 50 days. There's been a lot of concerns about where they are and what's happened to them. And the couple have been found, but without the baby. And they've now been arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. So it's obviously a live case. We can't say anything to prejudice their right to a fair trial rather. But it's really, really worrying that the baby wasn't found with them. We know very little about the baby. We don't even know whether it's a boy or a girl. The police are clearly extremely worried because the weather's very cold. They're not sure where the baby is, whether it might be outside and exposed to the elements. So there's a massive search underway. And it's just, I think it's just one of those stories where you read and you just sort of hope and pray that the little baby is okay, but the truth is we just don't know.
Yes, the prospect possibly that the baby's being looked after by someone else, they're holding out for that. But we saw the pictures there, Mark. This search area is absolutely vast, a corridor of 7 miles by 13 miles, some 91 square miles to be searched on, as Sonia said, a really cold night.
Indeed, and you can see, I think, in the footage there, in the coverage, and in the coverage we see in the newspapers today, but also what we've seen of this story and this search for this couple cropping up over the last 50-something days from intermittently, you can see the level of resource that's been put in. That is very illustrative of the level of official concern, evidently, by the officers and others involved in this case and this search. Quite what may have happened, I think it would be wrong for us to speculate, particularly as Sonia says, given this is a live investigation and there are charges and so on potentially doing the rounds. But a dreadfully concerning case in itself. And I think you can see, as I say, when this story, from when it first broke, that the police have evidently been very, very concerned at each stage.
Absolutely. And as Sonia was suggesting there, the couple not cooperating haven't even revealed the gender of the baby. So we watch, we wait, and we hope, don't we? Let's move on. Mark, I'm going to stay with you if you don't mind. Your reaction to the meetings that we've seen this evening. Rishi Sunak speaking to backbench MPs. We've seen the European Research Group of Tory Brexiteers meeting alongside the DUP. Where are we at? If we look at the Eye, Sunak gambles his political career on defying those Brexit deal critics. So he's going to go ahead with this, come what may. That's the suggestion from Downing Street.
Well, where we are in this is the Prime Minister is engaged in a battle for hearts and minds. Obviously, there are a variety of different groups and audiences. The wider electorate at large is obviously crucial to that. People who are sceptical of Brexit are very important to that too. But one part of that electoral coalition that he has to try and pull together and swing behind his deal, the Windsor deal, is the Leavers, the Brexiteers. And it's the fate of a Prime Minister that you can't choose the steps that were taken by your predecessors. And the fact is that all the way back to the referendum itself, through particularly the Theresa May era, there have been a variety of times when Brexiteers of all parties and none, and also Northern Irish Unionists, and particularly the DUP, feel like they've had their fingers burned, feel like they've been asked to trust one thing and haven't necessarily been able to do so. They feel let down, and that, through no fault of Rishi Sunak's, has left a position in which people are extremely wary. So what's interesting is we're hearing that the ERG and some others are not going to bring forward their opinion for potentially up to a fortnight formally, because they're taking detailed legal advice on exactly not just the UK text in English of this deal, but what the EU's own published version, of course, which may differ from their own their interpretation may differ from what Downing Street says. They're taking their time, they're taking advice because they want that reassurance. The Prime Minister evidently intends to use that time to bang the drum, to go and press the flesh, to go around and talk to people. It's interesting. I was at an event in Westminster earlier this evening where Steve Baker, now a minister, former chairman of the ERG, lifelong kind of long-standing core Brexiteer, was there telling people this is the best deal that's going to be available. This is the best deal that should be there, that could be there. That's why I'm behind it. And so there's a lot of that persuading to do, but there's a lot of painful history in recent years for him to overcome.
Yes, Steve Baker talking about the personal toll on him of these years of what's felt like battle, I suppose. Mark Francois telling us tonight, coming out of that meeting, that they're going to take 2 weeks. They've appointed their star chamber to pour over the details. The Eye saying that the DUP, they're going to take time to mull over it, and they're going to be seen to take time to mull over it, obviously. The problem is some people are a little bit sceptical because the DUP, would head back into Stormont not as top dog. It was Sinn Féin that won the last election, effectively, Sonia. They would go back as First Minister, and some people are signing some reluctance on the DUP for that reason. So, they've got a lot to think about.
I think we just have to hope that they get there, because I honestly think this is the best compromise we're ever going to.
Oh, I think she's frozen. Hello, Sonia? No, she's gone. Oh, she's back.
Sonia, me now?
Oh, sorry, we lost you. Start again.
I'll start again. I was just going to say, well, I think we have to really hope that the DUP come along with this, because I think it's the best compromise we're going to get. I think Rishi Sunak, to his credit, in many ways, I'm no fan of Rishi Sunak normally, but he took a very different negotiating approach to Boris Johnson. I think he created a relationship of trust with Ursula von der Leyen and, fellow leaders, political leaders like Macron across the EU. And I think this deal is genuinely as good as it gets. He's managed to get things that didn't look like they were on the table 3 years ago under Boris Johnson's premiership. So we do have customs checks down the Irish Sea, but the deal finds a way of minimising them. EU legislation and regulations do apply in Northern Ireland, but there is this so-called Stormont lock, which means that the Stormont Assembly have an appropriate veto power if it transpires that proposed EU regulations might have significant negative context and consequences, and you would have to have a period where basically the Republic of Ireland, the UK government and the EU go into negotiations with each other. So I think it really, there's no way of fully solving the Brexit conundrum when it comes to Northern Ireland, and this deal is as good as it's going to get. So I think we just have to hope that the DUP come along.
Yes, the Daily Express as well, Mark, Rishi's Brexit boost for the UK. I mean, is he in danger of overselling this? He talked about this unique position that Northern Ireland was in with the benefits of the internal market of the UK and the single market of the European Union, which everyone pointed out sounded very much like the benefits of us being in the European Union. So, and how does that go down with the DUP, who were the group that did not want us to stay in the EU?
Well, I think there's a little bit of clever kind of point scoring sometimes when people come out with stuff like that. It's a little bit like when Liz Truss was talking recently about the idea of a kind of wider alliance of Western democratic states with shared values, and various people kind of chin stroked and said, "Oh, lol, isn't that the same as the EU?" Well, it's not. I mean, the fact is that what we're talking about here, particularly, of course, what's interesting, which no one really is very into saying, I think, on either side of this, is this is essentially a kind of potential settlement for Northern Ireland that the EU would never be willing to offer to the UK as a whole. So it is an unusual position. What's interesting about this Express story is, of course, the Express became, I think, the first vocal Brexit newspaper. They were the first newspaper to support the Better Off Out campaign. They are coming out pretty heavily for this. I do think there are risks for the Prime Minister in this, obviously. He's decided that something he needs to grasp the nettle on. He's decided something where he wants to effectively revisit the power of that message back in 2019 of get Brexit done. The reason why it was quite a clever message is it worked for two different, it provided one answer to two different sets of voters. People who really supported Brexit and wanted to see it through, who felt like it had been thwarted and frustrated, but also people who were themselves frustrated, who were bored and read it as get Brexit over. And he's kind of returning to that a little bit, I think, by saying, well, this is the opportunity. If you're tired of this, Brexiteer or anti-Brexiteer, this is what I think is a sustainable way through. There is a risk for him, which is that if he sells it very warmly as is his responsibility, and then people look under the hood. There's an interesting article by the barrister Stephen Barrett, I think, published by The Spectator this evening, which starts to question whether it's quite as glowing as it's made out to be. There's a danger that people who are already a bit burned by this process might feel that perhaps it's got a bit more polish than it deserves. But we shall see what happens when he goes on this, as he goes around this campaign. Yeah,
I suppose the point is it's an improvement, whether there's bits that need, that are not 100% perfect. Got the Times as well now, Sonia. Deal is not negotiable. Sunak tells the DUP, suggesting that he'll push ahead without them. And then the paper goes on to say that unionist sources said the party's officers who will make a decision on its position were split, with members of the Stormont Assembly more strongly in favour of returning to power sharing, while the party's MPs in Westminster took a harder line. So we wait to see on that. I just wanted to talk about styles of leadership, though. The contrast with Rishi Sunak, who's managed to get this deal, and the way he now has this relationship with the European Union, which may unlock other matters. And also this idea that he's a cleaner-upper. He cleans up after the mess of Liz Truss. He's cleaned up after the years of the Northern Ireland Protocol and all that came with it. And whether this one-man bandwagon is enough to change the fortunes of the election, or if he might run out of time or the hope is lost. What do you think?
I'm not so sure about enough to sort of turn the Conservative electoral fortunes around. I think, sadly, actually, not that there isn't even enough awareness of the issues that Brexit has had in relation to Northern Ireland across the country. And I'm not sure that it's very high salience in terms of the way that voters will vote. Although, it's possible that people will look at this and say, well, he can get things done and he stands in contrast. Quite frankly, I think the Conservatives' electoral fortunes will be determined by the state of the economy in the next couple of years. And, there is a chance that it turns around, but things aren't looking that great, it has to be said, when you look at our growth forecasts. I do think, however, that Sunak has a very different style of leadership to Boris Johnson. And I think Boris Johnson and Lord Frost, who, took the lead on Brexit negotiations, they went in with very divisive tactics. They weren't really interested in building a trusted relationship. There was a lot of briefing to the British press about how terrible the EU was and how Britain was just going to get its way. And I just don't think it works when it comes to these types of negotiations. And I think Sunak has shown that, quite frankly.
OK, it's a massive area to talk about, isn't it, all of that? But we move on. And coming up after the break, we will have the latest on the reaction to the transgender rapist jailed for 8 years. Back in just a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me once again, the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the CEO of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace. Sonia, I'm going to go to you if you don't mind. The transgender rapist, furore around which possibly contributed to the demise of Nicola Sturgeon, has been jailed for 8 years and is heading to a man's jail or a men's jail.
Yes, and quite right too, I think. So this is the male rapist who used to be known as Adam Graham, now says that he identifies as a woman and calls himself Isla Bryson. It caused a huge political furore in Scotland because it came just after the passage of the Gender Reform Recognition Act that was backed by the SNP but had some support from other parties. And this was essentially legislation that said that anybody can change their legal sex on the basis of self-declaration. And that essentially means that any man who says that they're a woman, that they identify as a woman, can change their sex to female for legal purposes, which confers extra legal rights of access to women's single-sex spaces, hospital wards, prisons, single-sex sports. So there was huge concern in Scotland about this act. And, all the polling evidence suggests that the Scottish public were against it. It was blocked by the by the Westminster government following the passage of the legislation, because the Westminster government used the Scotland Act. They said that it would affect the operation of the Equality Act UK-wide, which is Westminster law that's determined by Westminster, not by Holyrood. But it's also had political consequences in Westminster. So Dominic Raab, the Justice Secretary, has now made it very clear that unless ministers overturn it, males who are convicted of sex offences or who have male genitalia cannot be housed in female prisons simply because they say they identify as women. I think that's absolutely right, but actually I think that there's no place for males in female-only prisons. Prisons are female-only for really important reasons, both from a safety perspective. They contain some of the most vulnerable women in society. The majority of women in female prisons are victims of domestic abuse, but also from a dignity and privacy perspective. So women who are incarcerated should not have to share showers. They should not have to share cells with people who are male. So I think Raab's announcement goes some way to answer those concerns from many women across the UK, but not fully.
OK, I know it's something that you feel very passionately about, certainly. Mark, I'm going to move on if you don't mind, though. I know you probably want to come in on that. The papers are dated March the 1st, which means we're 15 days away from the budget. You can start to feel the pressure on all sorts of areas on Jeremy Hunt, including in the Daily Express, that suggests that pressure's mounting on Jeremy Hunt to give pensioners a budget boost, as alarming figures reveal annual incomes for over 60s with jobs have plummeted by nearly £3,000. That and an energy rise as well, pressure on that too. So really, we've got 2 weeks of coverage trying to put the pressure on what Hunt might say come March the 15th.
On pressure on every front. I would say very briefly on that previous story, one thing Sonia didn't mention is I think this, had people not been willing to say, actually, there are real issues, real dangers and risks around failing to resolve this clash between dogma and reality as reflected in that case, had people not been willing to stick their necks out, I don't think reality and truth would have been able to reassert itself. And Sonia is actually one of those people who stuck their neck out and took an awful lot of quite unpleasant bile from various quarters for doing so. It's to her and many others' credit that they did so on that case. On this, the challenge facing the Chancellor in the next couple of weeks, you always see, particularly at a cost of living crisis facing such high inflation as we've seen in the last few months, a great amount of pressure on a Chancellor from all sorts of angles as to exactly where very limited resources should be allocated. What's really interesting, of course, and expect the government to talk this down for now, is that the forecasts on what the cost of various energy policies, the energy price guarantee and various support policies were going to be back in September, October, those forecasts have turned out to be much higher than the real cost. So it may well be that the Chancellor has much more, or quite a lot more sizable wriggle room than he might otherwise have expected. He's been telling us on corporation tax and various other spending policies as well that he doesn't think it's responsible to do things other than deficit reduction. It's going to be very interesting to see whether he does that, or whether he sticks to that, or whether he finds specific measures on tax or spending to what people might be able to directly take action using that headroom.
We could do a whole programme on what's to come, I think, probably, both of you. Thank you very much indeed. Mark, Sonia, lovely to have you on. Thank you. See you in the